Wow. That's a great turnout for like the first NG Toronto. I'm like super excited to get started. Before we actually jump into the macro benefits of micro front ends, I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce myself. I'm Alex. I'm a German living here in Toronto, and I'm a software engineer at Sherpa. I'm also a little bit curious. Who of you guys still remembers these folks? A couple people? Believe it or not, they actually made it to Germany and is still today one of my favorite childhood TV shows. And somehow, magically, they still hold up to it, and maybe today we can actually see why it's still fascinating me. Also, just a little hands up to get an idea of like who is in the audience. Who is actually not a Canadian or had to apply for an electronic travel authorization in the past to enter a foreign country? A couple people. So for those that don't know what an ETA is, an electronic travel authorization is a little code that you get by registering with a foreign government. It is usually tied to your passport, and as soon as you check into at the airport, the actual airline knows if you're authorized to travel or not. So it's a very secure system that is getting more and more established with other governments. But unfortunately, the entire process to actually apply for it is still up to the traveler, the person who's actually going onto the journey. You still have to figure out how do I actually apply for it, where do I go, what information do I need. So that's why we at Sherpa have a solution that integrates into other systems that allows you to have a seamless experience to actually apply for the documents that are necessary for your travel. So we partner up with airlines and travel agencies and even cruise ships. In order to do that, we actually have to provide ways that is very easy for them to take our solution and integrate it into their existing website. And as you can imagine, that can be like a really old legacy system or like a high-end technology, cutting-edge solution in a very scalable web solution. So there are a lot of challenges that come along with that. And we really think about how can we make that best way to integrate into that. And today, I would like to share with you one of those techniques that we are discovering very actively, which is known as micro front ends. So I dropped now a couple times the word micro front end without really explaining what it is. Well, if we actually look at ThoughtWorks, which is an organization that looks at the technology space in general and tries to classify them. Is it a technology that you should just hold off because it's way too new? Or should you give it a try? They revisited micro front ends just in April this year and assessed it's ready for adoption. Okay, so we know now we can adopt to micro front ends, but we still don't know what they are. Well, let's go back in time. And not just back in time where we might use Alta Vista to Google for things or ICQ to WhatsApp people. Also back in time where we had this idea to create a web solution, and we maybe just had like one or two developers. And all we had to do is to spin up a web server and deliver our assets. Nothing really fancy, it worked. But soon enough, we actually figured out, oh, there's something behind it. We need to like change our requirements. We need to cover more use cases. So our little like monolith started to grow and grow and grow, and the complexity almost strangled us. It was just too complicated to keep up to date, to even like push out small changes. So we cut through this entire monolith and started to split it up into a dedicated front end and a dedicated back end. But at the same time, our growing team from like now maybe like a few, 10 people, dozen, has now actually specialized in a front end. People that are extremely passionate about providing the best user interface possible, and people on the back end. People who are just really performance driven and trying to squeeze out as much data as possible in as short time as possible to serve it up to the front end. But soon enough, we also started to face a couple of like challenges. Mostly because the backend team started to like realize, oh, actually there are like certain areas of focus in our backend that integrates maybe in other systems or serves up the front end. So we had like kind of these clusters that also started to get complex in scaling. So as our application grew, we started to cut the backend now into slices, known as microservices. So we might have like a dedicated system for our search, dedicated system for like products or like for a payment. But we still had to put an aggregation layer on top of that to actually allow our unchanged front end to still have one single gateway of entry to communicate with that backend. Soon enough, we were able to like serve hundreds, thousands of requests a second, but yet again, something was changing. The user requirements and the features that we wanted to bring in started to change. But this time, we now wanted to actually look into the front end to actually see, oh, we actually have a cluster of users that are in a particular segment, and we want to start experimentation. What if we change this button a little bit? Can we convert better? If we advertise our products in a different way, how will that help us to actually show the users what the benefits of the products are? So it became really challenging to do that. And the solution to overcome this is actually to slice down the front end the same way we did it on the back end. But now we changed it into something we call here now micro frontends. And it allows us now to have these vertical slices that are represented end to end with cross-functional teams. So before, we split up in two different teams. Now we're bringing all these teams back together, but in a way that we now have a front-end engineer together with a back-end engineer, maybe a UX researcher and a designer alongside. And they're working on a real problem, not just like a technical feasibility, but also focusing on the actual mission to whether it's helping a customer to discover new products or providing the fastest way to actually find a product. So with this focus, we see like a really strong shift into something that we can utilize. And that is known as micro frontends. This is a screenshot I took from IKEA. IKEA actually uses micro frontends. They're using a slightly different technology that I would like to present you today, but it still illustrates very nicely how all these elements actually work together. So if you look at the top right corner in red, we have the checkout. So this is actually like its own mini application inside of that website that interacts independently with the entire website. Team search, here highlighted in blue, might be able to like focus on only that search aspect. Everything that is driven from that team is like inside of that kind of container. Team product, here highlighted in green, could like focus really on here are the product details, and these are the best ways to actually show what the product is and how it would work. Some people of you might now recognize a couple like color schemes that go along with it. Try to think of micro frontends as the Power Rangers. Each Power Ranger is individual as its own, but once they unite into like a Megazord, they actually become unbeatable. And the same applies to actually micro frontends, because they're like tiny isolated applications that are stitched together into like one application that is the host, and together they can just do wonderful, amazing things. There's a lot of benefits that come along with it, which is basically allowing you to now remain focused on a user. You become user-centric. Everything that each vertical team is doing and focused on is surrounded by the user. How does it benefit and how does it add value? A lot of people might think like, okay, so it sounds very complex, but I have my system that exists there. Do I need to recode everything? Do I need to like toss everything away that I have and start with this new approach? Well, because everything is like isolated in small slices, we can actually do incremental updates. Maybe you have an old system that still runs on AngularJS 1.54 because you didn't even had the chance to update to 1.6. But it's fairly easy to take out one single chunk from that overall solution and replace it maybe with a new technology, maybe like the latest Angular 8 version to give your team a chance to experiment and learn with it. You're not losing out on customers. You're still providing new features and can add to that as you go through these incremental updates. Overall, you're just building up a more maintainable architecture. Each micro app on its own ideally should be completely isolated. That means you have your own slice of data, you have your own system that comes with it, you have your own build, test, and actual deployment pipelines that are completely separated from the rest of those other vertical teams. That allows you to reduce that communication between teams and just push out changes way quicker because you have less dependency on each other. The ability to have these autonomous teams can be tremendous. You're really reducing that communication layer that I just mentioned before, and you allow them to actually independently work on the things that really matter. But with all these benefits at hand, you also should keep a few core things in mind. You still have now created several projects. That still means that you have to maintain those several projects, and you should have a team size that is justified to actually taking in that approach. If you're still around these like 5 or a dozen people, it might be not the right solution for the problem that you're trying to solve or working on. Another thing that you need to keep in mind is you have now ideally distributed data. You can't really be independent if you're still depending on like one data surface area that you need to request. So ideally, each micro app has its own little slice and island that they can store information into and retrieve it. But overall, everything is connected and integrated into it. Pretty much like microservices, but now full up through the user interface. Another thing to consider is what we're going to do with the user interface. So now we have like all these micro apps, and each team is independent. So can they make their independent designs? How can we ensure that like one button in one micro app looks exactly the same and behaves the same like another micro app? So we don't want to write the same code again, and we don't want to really think about the same styling and the same colors over and over again for each team. So having a design system, which is basically a guideline that tells you how to implement your interface, how things should work, and even how should the voice of your interface look like, is like composited in like that design system. Usually what comes at hand is that a design system as a document doesn't stop to exist. It comes along with a UI library. So you actually have shared components that you can utilize across all these like micro apps. So these are just like things to really keep in mind. But we see a lot of these transitionings already happening in organizations because people are actively working on design systems. People are working actively on UI components to make their life easier. Micro frontends really just help you to push you to those isolation and help you to articulate those. We're like here like a technical meetup, so I don't want to leave without providing you a little bit of code. This is not going to be like a live coding session, but I want to get you a little bit started to really break through how would you start a micro front-end solution for your own and how to get started. I'll be posting the slides afterwards and a link to a repository that goes through these steps and has a couple like additional elements to it that we were not able to like cover today. So the first part will be how we're actually preparing a monorepo. So I call this approach the monorepo shell approach because we're creating a monorepo that takes care of like having different components in one place, in one code base. But it's also the shell approach because we have one application that is the host and the shell, and all the micro apps are stitched together into it. So we're going to create first our micro app, and then our shell, and then integrate both. In order to initialize our NX workspace, we just create a new workspace and keep it empty because we're going to add our application ourselves. The second step will be to add the Angular capabilities because, of course, we want to have a shell application that is a nice web application built in Angular. And we already can create our first micro app. So in this case, I'm taking the example of airlines and flight booking. So our micro app is going to be dedicated to flights. So we create a new app, and we add one of the new exciting features that come with Angular, Angular elements. What Angular elements do is they turn your Angular component into a standardized web component. So it becomes reusable no matter what framework we actually be using. And in code, this would look something like that. We just initialized our flights app, and the first step that we're going to do is we modify our index HTML to include our Airways flights. This is going to be our web component. On the left-hand side, you see the app component that now removed the selector. We don't rely on the app component initial selector because we create it as a web component. The styling is just going to be removed, and our app component HTML will just display book your flights. This is just a very simple illustration in a most minimal way. The now exciting part is actually happening in our app module. And there's a few things I want to highlight. First, we removed from the bootstrap our app component. So our bootstrap is completely empty. We added a couple schemas that are necessary for elements, which is the custom element schema, and we defined a new entry component as our app component. And because we removed our component from the bootstrap, we have to tell Angular that we're going to take care of that. And we do it by utilizing the ngDoBootstrap method and take care of that ourselves. So we create a custom element, and we pass in the injector from our application into the component so Angular is aware of it. And then we define a new element, airways-flights, that will be now available as a standardized HTML component across our application. So once we actually run and serve our app, here noted on port 4230, we actually see that we have our web component, Airways Flights, and inside we see book your flights. It's not an exciting interface, but I think you get along. Now, we need to create our shell application, the app that will host all of our micro apps. So we spin up NX again and create that shell. Again, the component will be very simple. Welcome to NG Airways. But the main difference is now we have a new div container that has the ID tag content. Inside of that content, all our micro apps in this example will be injected into it. The way we do it is we implement our app component with a quite interesting strategy. We have here a main config. It's just a simple JSON object that takes a URL, something on the web, and basically injects it into a script element. As soon as the component is loaded, we make sure that we only load that component once and add the script tag, the URL that we defined there, into the actual DOM HTML side of our shell. But because we loaded only the source, but not the component, we need to create a plain new HTML component, here called again Airways Flights. So we see that in line 13 highlighted. So we boot up our application, our shell, now on port 4200. We see that our script file got injected, loaded, and it still looks like the shell. Where's our micro app? Well, what happens is if you actually look at the source builds is we initially build it with all these artifacts, with the runtime, with the vendors, with the styles. What we need to do now is actually compress everything into one single file that we can serve into our shell. There's an amazing build tool called NGX Build Plus, which we apply to our flights project, which provides us with an additional operation flag on our serve. So now we can say single bundle and basically tell our build that we want to have one single bundle for our solution. So you see on the left-hand side, we only have our main.js, which is served on 4230 port. If we now look at our solution refresh, we see that we now have book your flights inside of our Welcome on NG Airways app. If we look at the source code, we actually see that now our HTML tag that we defined got filled out with the web component, the actual app that we created. So this is a great example to actually see how the shell can host an own component, which is actually yet another Angular application. So this can actually grow as complex as you want it to be. There's still certain restrictions that come at hand, but it really highlights the kind of power that can be driven by that. You have like a mini app inside of another application. And I didn't reboot the actual shell host. It still remained the same. So we actually did like an independent deployment almost for like micro app. I want to give you at hand a couple of like really useful resources. I didn't create everything by myself, invented it. A big highlight to like Manfred Steyer, you see a lot of like his talks, his specialization in micro front ends, which helped me here a lot, and a couple of like really good links that are definitely worthwhile to check out. If you get excited as much as I do about like micro front ends, definitely have a look at them. And that's so far the end. Thank you very much.